Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness, and Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about finding happiness where you are. So, Donovan, let's kick off this conversation. What are your initial thoughts when it comes to finding happiness where you are?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different pieces here, and one of the first ones is sort of at the surface, right? Finding happiness where you are probably brings to mind like your physical location, and I do think there is a good chunk to talk about there. But I think there's also pieces around, finding happiness where you are in terms of where you are in your career or your family life or with your relationships and basically where you are in a more metaphorical sense with a lot of things. So to me, there's just a bunch of different angles we could hit it from, but it all roots into the same thing, which is how do you find happiness with the things that you currently have?
Mm, hmm Yeah, no, I kind of interpret it that way too, in that like kind of accepting what is your current situation. And I think there is happiness in finding that. Although I think like the struggle for people, I would imagine, is like, well, what if you're in a really crappy situation, living situation, or relationship or job? How do you find happiness in that? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to pull it back and then I'll come back to this, but there's a bunch of studies, right, that show for the vast majority of life events, which is usually how you end up in sort of one of these like extra negative situations.
Right.
The vast majority of those only have an impact on your happiness or like relative baseline level of happiness for a set period of time, right? So, for
Mm,
example, I don't remember the details off the top of my head, but like let's say that you I don't know, get in a car crash and get injured, but not like paralyzed or even it actually does apply to some of these stronger things, but like lower, let's say you break your leg or something, right? The unhappiness that you have from that tends to only last for, we'll say 6 months. I don't know the actual amount of time, but after that time, you tend to revert back to sort of what your baseline is. And the reason I bring this up is because finding happiness sort of in your day-to-day life in any circumstance, really, I believe is more about sort of the processes that you have in your day-to-day life as opposed to the external circumstances. Now, don't get me wrong, it's much easier to be happy in certain scenarios than others, but there's just a bunch of research out there that shows you go back to your baseline. So I think the key is to find the strategies and tools and habits that you need to actually move your baseline, and that will serve you a lot better or have a lot more impact than sort of striving towards or like trying to move these external metrics all the time, because I'm sure you've heard of on the opposite side of things, right? In good circumstances where it's like, oh, so and so won the lottery or something, and then you hear about how they were really happy for 6 months or whatever that period actually is, and then it's sort of reverted back. Or people that get the promotion, or people who find a partner, or all these different things that actually change the life circumstances that you're in, that don't necessarily change your day to day and the way that you're looking at things and the habits that you have, which are the things that, based on what I've seen from the research and whatnot, are far more impactful on your actual day to day happiness.
mm. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense because I think, there are incidences where we're like almost in a way chasing happiness, like, oh, once I achieve this thing, then you'll be elated for a temporary period of time, but it's not going to last. Depending on the situation, it's going to go back to your baseline. That makes a lot of sense. I would just be curious on, how do people like, okay, if this is where their baseline is, it's like, what do I do? Like, I could imagine like someone who has no experience with this type of stuff wouldn't be like, okay, well, if I'm not chasing happiness, how do I increase my baseline happiness? I guess it's like, what does that look like? I'm not quite sure. But I get what you're saying because I think this is actually a very common like Buddhist principle in a way of like accepting where you are and finding happiness and joy in that. So
Yeah, I think to answer your question, it's more about the ways that you chase happiness or try to find or increase happiness
Mm-hmm.
than it is that actual goal. Now, we've talked about it before, like
Yeah.
chasing happiness is sort of a little bit of a weird concept in and of itself. But
Right.
let, if your overall goal is to increase your happiness, the way that you try to do that, I think, is really important.
Mm.
And the default for a lot of people who aren't exposed to any of this information is to try to improve their external circumstances, right?
Right.
So if I get more money, if I have a nicer car, if I have
And I'll be
a
happier.
hotter partner, I have whatever, right? Like whatever these things are, is sort of the things that people tend to chase.
Mhm.
Whereas what you should be focusing on to get the most mileage is a lot of the stuff we've already talked about before, but it's like, what is your relationship with certain events, right? The way that you process information. How are you taking care of yourself, taking care of your body? What are your relationships like? How are you actually communicating with people and things like that? Those are the things that tend to increase your baseline more than some of these other things that are more external, like making more friends instead of deepening relationships or improving the quality of relationships.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. For my own personal experience, I can think of, achieving certain milestones were only, you know, producing temporary happiness, but like the increasing the baseline for myself just required a lot of like looking inward and doing some personal development and kind of also working through some of my own like past garbage and working on reducing my anxiety and working on just like me in itself versus like chasing external achievements or like, oh, once I get that job, once I get that pay raise, or once I get that relationship, it'll be happier. But I found that, like for example, when I had my last major breakup with my previous partner of 4 years, it really took like I had to discover happiness within myself. It wasn't like, oh well, I need a better relationship. Wasn't what I was seeking right away. It was just like, let's focus on me. And then happiness came. And then I think that invited a new love. But I was already happy with myself first and foremost.
Yeah, that helped me sort of think of another example that we could use, which is for me, there was a time where I was working like in customer service stuff.
Yeah.
And what I was really chasing was a promotion, right? And I was like, I think this promotion is going to help me a lot. Um, and I had in my mind that like once that external thing changed, it'd be better. I got one, and it's the same sort of thing. Like for a month or two, I felt better, and then it went right back to the baseline. And I was still just as unhappy in that higher position until I realized, and here's like a prime example to me of something you can actually work on, until I started changing my mindset around like, oh, I'm doing this job anyway, right? I'm already here.
Right.
I
Yeah.
need to find ways to make this meaningful because what's making me unhappy is that I don't feel like this is meaningful and I don't feel like this is taking me where I want to go.
Mm.
And so I did a bunch of work around like, which of the skills out of this job can I take with me into the future? And when I was able to hone down into that and
Mhm.
focus on that, I felt a lot happier, even though the situation hadn't changed, right? This is after I got the promotion, like, and I was still unhappy.
Right.
But I was able to shift that baseline by changing my relationship with that part of my life.
Mm.
And I feel like there are many instances where that's can be true, right? Where basically the frame of the thing that you're looking at makes a huge difference on your day-to-day happiness. And for me personally, that's where I've got the most mileage out of raising my baseline is
Mm.
changing sort of the relationship or frame that I've had on all kinds of different things, right? So another one that I think we've talked about before is the way that I used to interact with people is I felt a lot more defensive, or I would just see like people taking actions in a certain way as bad people. And that made me unhappy a lot of the time. But when I was able to open up this new frame of like, most people are actually doing what they think is right. And if I try to step into their shoes and figure out why they might be thinking that,
Mm.
it gives me a lot more empathy and compassion to open up space for myself. Now, I might not agree, but it worked much better than when I was carrying around this belief of like, there are just a lot of bad people in the world doing bad things on purpose. So those are the kinds of things that I feel like were able to work for me to increase my happiness where I already was, as opposed to sort of shifting around sort of my external circumstances.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, that first example that you gave, it reminded me of when we were talking to the career coach, Lindsay, about and she shared like a really interest. So if you haven't watched this episode, go reference back to the career coach episode, because the interesting thing that she shared was that she's working with a lot of like people in tech who are just not happy in their job, they're not fulfilled, and so she's helping them like explore other options potentially that might be more fulfilling, but ultimately through like a lot of personal development work and coaching, like half of them ended up staying at the job that they are currently at and finding a new way to kind of have a different perspective on it. And I thought that was pretty fascinating and interesting because that can really make the difference. I noticed my own partner, he tends to like after a year or so he starts complaining more about the job. He gets like worn down and he just wants to find a new job. And this is like a continuous pattern. And I was like, well, maybe if you find like a little more purpose or find something that would get you excited to go to this 9 to 5 job, then maybe that would be more fulfilling. So I get that that's not easier said than done, obviously, but definitely could make a difference.
Yeah, and I think, because I don't want to solely lock in that if you're unhappy, you should
Right.
just change your attitude about it.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
there are definitely
Totally.
situations where it is easier or harder to be happy.
Mhm.
But again, those external changes a lot of times are not long lasting, especially if they're ones that are um,
Right.
less intentional, right? Things that just sort of like show up in life, good or bad.
Mhm.
So if you can work through sort of a combination of the internal pieces and the external pieces, that's where you're going to get the most out of it. But a lot of times people are not doing the work. I know I've personally been guilty of this, but not doing the work to find sort of the optimal happiness for the current situation.
Mm.
And it's also really easy. I've done this a lot to sort of backslide if you're not paying attention, right? Whereas like you had in your mind this clear idea of what you wanted to do, and that's why you took on this particular job or whatever, or the skills you wanted to gain, or whatever it is. And then over time, forget about that and start focusing on like, well, this person is nitpicking my work, and this person talked
Mhm.
down to me a little bit, and this person did this. So another thing that can be useful is once you have started adjusting those frames to make sure that you revisit them or can go back into it. Again, you probably hit a certain point or could hit a certain point where it's like, I was here for these skills. I think I've gained them. Everyone here's kind of being mean, whatever else, like I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But I think both of those things, they have to work together. And a lot of people just focus on that external, like, oh, this person is acting in this way and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. There's a difference between like a sense of hopelessness, there's nothing I can do. And I totally get that, if you're working with, for example, like a toxic boss or something, that's maybe a situation you do want to get out of. But at the same time, it's like there is only so much that you can do. So it is the situation. Maybe you can't just quit your job like that. So you have to work towards finding a new position, whatever that might be. But in the meantime, before you start a different job and you do have to put up with this terrible boss potentially, there's a way to kind of change your mindset and kind of not let it get to you as much. It made me think of there's this one book that really I think is relevant to this particular topic that I've read, and I might have recommended it in the past, but it's called Loving What Is: 4 Questions That Can Change Your Life by Katie Byron. And or Byron Katie. I first reverse it because her last name sounds like a first name. And she uses this example where she would get really, really frustrated and annoyed with her kids for always just leaving socks on the floor and just never picking them up. No matter how many times she reminded them, they would just not do it and it'd drive her crazy. And I've been guilty of being this person all the time with my husband or someone who would just do things that would just drive me crazy, and it's such a minutia kind of little thing, but it still like caused such rage in me. And she had to like switch it in her mindset of being like, accepting that the fact of the matter is that her kids are never going to pick up the songs. It's only enraging you. It doesn't bother them, and it's not going to ever bother them. So it's like, you can pick up the socks yourself, and you can find joy in picking up the socks, is how she like shifted her mindset, which again, easier said than done, but that's a way to like, is it worth the rage over like socks on the ground, or just pick it up so you don't have to be upset anymore. And yeah, it's annoying that you have to be the one to do it, but if it's really causing you rage, you can pick up that sock. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it brings up a couple interesting concepts. One of which is sort of acceptance, which we'll probably should unpack a little bit more, because
Yeah.
that's so important for finding happiness sort of where you are. And I actually think another important concept to talk about is like not making yourself miserable where you are, right?
Right,
Because
yes.
that's a perfect example where it's like you have some control and influence over the way that you react to someone doing something like leaving socks on the floor.
Mhm.
And if you've tried different things to sort of, get the other person to do whatever it is and they're not doing it, if you can, like you just said, sort of accept that that's how it's going to be. So your options are let them be there, pick it up yourself,
Yeah.
whatever else there is,
Right.
and focus on what you can do instead of just making yourself miserable and just thinking like, oh, they should be doing something different. Oh, this should be different.
Mm.
Those sort of like should be type of
Mhm.
thoughts are one way to just drive yourself insane and make yourself miserable. So
Right.
now that I think about it, a lot of sort of the ideas we've been talking about, and a lot of at least what I've experienced in the past, is also as opposed to finding happiness where you are and really like boosting yourself way up, especially if you're in transition or working towards something else, is not making yourself miserable with where you are, right? There may be some amount of discomfort or unpleasantness in your current situation, but there are absolutely a huge number of ways that you can make it significantly worse for yourself by focusing on certain things over other ones. So that's another thing that I've gotten a lot of mileage out of, is
Mhm.
intentionally shifting my focus when I find myself focusing on things that don't matter, like, oh, some, socks on the ground, towards
Right.
things that do matter and things that are important.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. And it just made me think of like something that has helped me in those situations, because it's like we've all been through difficult times in our life. And yeah, we can grumble about it and be negative, which is okay. There's something about giving yourself space to grumble for a little bit, but at some point, you don't want to grumble for grumble forever. So allowing yourself to think, what has helped me is like, okay, what one, this is probably not permanent. It's not going to last forever. So keeping that in mind helps shift my mind. It's just like, this is temporary. This is going to be over at some point. I don't know when, maybe, or maybe I do. Maybe like when I was in med school, I knew there was an end point. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. But other situations might not be that case. The other thing is like, okay, this is really challenging and this is really difficult, but what do I have to gain out of it is like the second question I would ask myself. And there's like always a lesson to be learned. And, like going through a breakup, that was really, really difficult. Or like losing a job or something to that extent was really challenging. But ultimately, it helped shape me who I am now. And like reflecting back, it's like, oh, I'm glad I went through those difficult situations, because it's led me to where I am now, even though in that moment I might have been like, well, this really sucks. So but thinking about like, okay, a few years from now, I'll look back and this will be a really helpful defining moment of my life that shaped me into who I am and where I am today.
Yeah, that's a number of things that are well researched in terms of things that you can do to improve your happiness. Like one of the things you mentioned was sort of uh well, not explicitly, but story making, right? Like how you fit sort of these experiences into your story,
Right.
and in a way that's meaningful as opposed to a way that's pointless. and looking for sort of those messages or lessons or whatever you want to call them and integrating them into your story is one way that there's, again, a good amount of research behind that this is a way to improve your happiness. And then you also mentioned sort of the focus on what there is to gain. Like if you can do it, you can do it retrospectively, and you can also do it prospectively, right? Like as you think about, oh, here are the things I have coming up. What do I stand to actually gain from this, even though it's not necessarily going to be pleasant all the time? I think those are both really useful tools that you can use to sort of ground yourself when things are not as pleasant as they otherwise could be. One other piece that I wanted to bring up is I want to take it to like the more physical, like finding happiness where you are, right? Geographically.
Oh, I could talk about that for sure.
I would be curious on your thoughts. Like I've moved around a bunch recently, so I have some things, but I'm curious where you're at first.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking that. I actually just got back from a trip in Italy, and I was enjoying the slow life of how they take like 2-3 hours to have a meal, essentially, which is a different shift. And still felt like my American urgency to be like, when is the check coming? When is this meal coming? Like, when is this coming? Like all of that. But and it was just a joy to be there in so many ways. But I know that's not really realistic. I can't just live a laid back life. I have to get back to my life in California, back to reality, back to my various jobs and commitments and responsibilities. But as far as physical locations, I think about, it's interesting. I've been talking about like what's my favorite season, and it really depends on where I am physically. Like in Sacramento, we have really ridiculously hot summers. Like there's a week of like 100+ degree weather, and that's not very fun. So my least favorite season in Sacramento is summer, but the rest of the year is great. So I'm like, okay, one not so great season out of 4 is not so bad. So, but in Seattle, when I lived there for 11 years, my favorite season was summer because the weather was perfect. But then the rest of the year was like gloom and doom and gray and mist and rain and all of that. So I still love Seattle. It has a favorite special place in my heart. And I just visited a few months ago, and it's just the people, the fresh air. It's a different, I think it was just like who I was around made the difference. And helped me get through the dreary weather. But then I've also lived on the East Coast, where the winters are extreme, the summers are extreme, hot and humid, not so great. Winters, foot mile, like feet of snow, essentially. It's not fun to deal with. But I still somehow managed to find a way to make it more enjoyable, even though I didn't particularly like half the year or more there seasonally. But it was just a matter of like finding community, finding people to make the seasonal differences better for my experience. So I've moved around a lot. I guess ultimately it would suck to have a place that was miserable year round. So I'm grateful to be where I am now. But the key, I think, has been in my happiness is having community, doing things that bring me joy, regardless of like this. And maybe my activities vary depending on what area or climate I'm located at. And yeah, continuing just to work on myself and my relationships and my personal development skills.
Yeah, so I think you touched on some important points, and the topic that I want to start breaking open is like this idea that moving somewhere else will make you happier.
Right.
And I think that can potentially be true, but it is something you have to tread very lightly, right? So when you move, a lot of the things you mentioned will change, right? Like, for example, the weather. I mean, if you're moving far enough or to enough of a different place.
Yeah.
The people or sort of the culture, like you mentioned, like, in Italy it was slower and laid back. Where you are, it feels faster than that. So like some of those external things will change. But I also know from personal experience from I've had a couple moves in the distant past now where I thought like, oh, if I move from this place to this place, I'll be a lot happier.
Mm.
And certain things did work where it was like, moving from my original hometown to Salt Lake City. I'll use that example.
Mhm.
Certain things changed in terms of I was able to access a lot more people, just people, flat out people. So I could meet more people, had more opportunities to sort of interact with different kinds of people, more diversity, things like that. But other things came with me, right? So like at that time, I found it very hard to socialize at a what generic level,
Mhm.
and those sort of things came with me. So for example, like in my hometown, I felt like a little bit awkward and distant and different, partially like we've talked about because of religion differences, right?
Right.
But part of it was because I didn't have the skills to actually communicate with people well.
Mm. Mhm.
So when I moved, like the religion stuff faded a little bit, or actually a lot. But some of these communication skills problems or things that I was unhappy with stayed.
Mm. Mhm.
So I think it's really important if you're going to move with sort of this idea of being happier, you have to look at what are the things that you're actually trying to change. And you mentioned community as an important piece, and I will echo that. I think that that's also true. And that is something that is or can be potentially really valuable at whatever place you've been for the longest amount of time. Like whatever people you've built up is a really valuable resource and a large contributor to happiness. But I guess the main point I'm trying to make from this long ramble is basically if you're going to move with the idea of being happier somewhere else, you really have to dive into the nuances of which of these things are actually because of the environment and which
Mm.
of these things are because of the way that I am or the skills that I have or the habits I've developed or whatever else. Because if it is mostly that second bucket of your own personal stuff and you move around, it's not going to help you at all.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just realized when you were talking about that, I had already, it was the move itself, like I was already happy before the move. So it was like, I wasn't like trying to escape people I don't like or anything like that. It was like relationship or life situation that had me move. And so it was scary in a way to have to start over with zero community. It's like w- beginning that. And I think when I moved from Seattle to the East Coast, it sort of for like I wasn't, I mean, I was happy to continue my relationship that I moved for essentially, but I didn't know anyone on the East Coast besides my significant other. And so I think it pushed me, like I don't feel like I was unhappy, but I think it like pushed me to seek out more like skill sets and communication skills and personal development and all of that to increase my happiness. And it took a while, and it was like kind of like I stayed in a comfort zone, and it kind of like I had to push myself to get out of it, to expand myself, to eventually expand my community. Yes.
Yeah, I feel like, a lot of times life situations push people towards um these certain like growth paths, and it's not always like, how do I want to put this? It's not always in people's control whether or not they're going to move or not, or like not. I don't want to say not in their control, but it's not always like based solely on happiness. Sometimes there are other circumstances that sort of push people in one direction or another.
Yeah.
But I think, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit, it's so important to build up that sort of baseline level of happiness because it's going to be stronger than your physical location
Hmm.
in almost every circumstance. I was actually recently back home and was thinking while I was there, like when I grew up there, I absolutely hated it. And it's still not a place I would want to live because there's a number of factors that just make it not desirable to me.
Hmm.
But I was realizing while I was there, now that it's been however long, that I have built up so many more skills for my own personal happiness that I if I had to for some reason move back there, I would be significantly happier and more connected and all these other things than I was in the past. And it's so interesting to me because when I moved originally, my mindset was so ingrained in just like, this is not a place that I could live and be happy because of the way that the place is.
Yeah.
But looking back and having been there recently, it was like, no, I couldn't be happy there because of the way that I was.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I wouldn't want to be there now. And there are a lot of factors that make it so that it's not ideal for me. But now I think I could move to an even smaller town,
Yeah.
which in the past would have been like my worst nightmare. I still would kind of hate it, but
Yeah.
and I have enough tools or like at least enough understanding of myself now to figure out like, okay, here's what I would do to make the most of this. And I would be far happier now than I ever could have been in the past just because I did so much work internally, even though the external factors really haven't changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could really relate to that situation because it took a while for me to really find happiness, and it was almost like my breakup and discovering myself that like pushed the happiness meter up in a way in that personal growth journey. But now that I'm in Sacramento, and even though the summers are ridiculously hot and I hate it, I love living here. I love being near my family. I love, that it's not ridiculously hot the rest of the year. And yeah, it just seems like it's funny though, because when I was like younger, maybe like a teenager, and my brother and sister went to UC Davis, and I was like, ew, Sacramento, I would never want to live there because it's so hot. For pew, like ew, that sounds like a terrible idea. So I was just like, it wouldn't be like, if I were thinking of cities to like ultimately settle down, Sacramento would not have been on my list for sure. But now that I've been here, I've learned to love it, and I love it a lot more than the East Coast. But at the same time, I realized that I didn't really love the East Coast right away. It took time, it took effort, but eventually I got there. And it was funny because when I finally got there, I was like enjoying it. I had community and friends and loving my life. Then I moved. It wasn't like, oh, I'm miserable or I don't like it as much. Every time I've moved, it's been hard because it's like, oh, I'm leaving something behind that I really cared about and enjoyed. But it's for whatever reason, my own growth, my own development, relationship, whatever it might be, that helped me discover that, oh, actually I can be happier in a different place. But it's funny because I was already happy, but it just like took time to find happiness in a new place and kind of experimenting with a lot of things.
I would be curious if on your journeys to the East Coast,
Yes.
if your or like how much of your liking of it was tied to developing community, right? Do you think there were other factors like, oh, I found out places to go and this and that, or do you think it was like anchored in community? I'm just curious what you think the percentage breakdown or however you want to describe it was.
I mean, like, for like my significant other was part of was like my main socialization. But I think what helped was that I was a business owner, and it kind of like forces you to get to know the community, especially because I was in a small town, which was a lot different than what I was used to. Small town, so people know each other. So I got to know like the community, at least on the business wise scale of just networking events and things like that. And slowly got more comfortable with people. But then it was like when I started doing more personal development courses, and I got to build community there, and that built like deeper friendships because we were talking about deeper things. I mean, I probably could have done it with the community, like the business community, but usually talking about business versus like personal things. So it kind of depends. You kind of I had to like thrust myself into various communities, and it wasn't always comfortable because it's like the awkwardness of like, I don't know anyone. And yeah, getting over that part. But because like, and we've talked about this before, it's always harder to build friendships post college because you're not like in a scheduled like type of environment, but you can put yourself in it. Maybe you join a sports group or business networking group or personal development group or whatever that might be, and that helps, and that really made the difference for me.
Yeah, so I guess I'm gonna try a different way of asking this because it
Okay,
sort
did
of
I
answered
answer
it,
your
but I
question?
still have a question. So
Yeah.
it's let's see. So given that community, like developing a community or integrating with the community
Yeah.
was something that vastly increased your happiness,
Hmm.
were there other factors that came into play, or was your increase in happiness pretty much mirrored by your increase being integrated in the community?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of that answer is kind of integrated in like I had to work on myself and my own development to build a community. So it's kind of like
Mm, mm,
interconnected in
mm.
a way. So I mean that was a huge factor in just like working on myself and my own joy and happiness outside of people, not depending on people to be happy, but like working on myself and then being able to communicate and connect with people on a deeper level really helped me increase my happiness too.
Cool. Let me see if I'm tracking now,
Yes.
which is it sounds like you spent some time while you were there
Yeah.
sort of grounding into yourself and your values and working on some practices and things like that. And that's what allowed you to open up more to be more integrated into the community and sort of like bring people in and connect and do these other things.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And it was my ability to like the personal development courses I did, especially like the thing that really made the difference for me was probably in my last year there. I had been there for almost 4 years. Really increased, amplified the happiness was just it's like twofold. It was like a personal development course, but then there was community as part of that. And it was like right after my breakup, and I was just like a sobbing mess. And I had shared this story before where I was like out to dinner with this group of girls that were gonna be in my group for the class for the 4 months, and I just burst into tears in front of them. And we became a solidified girl group who were supportive of each other ever since. And they all came out to my birthday like a couple weeks later, and they were complete strangers. So, but it was like through that personal development work that gave me the ability to be more expressive, to be more vulnerable, to not be so bottled up, and not worry about like, oh, people are gonna think XYZ if I burst into tears, and not basically not giving an F about what people think, of just letting that go was all sort of the personal development work too.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example of just how important finding or developing a sense of community is, because I think a lot of people that are unhappy, or like one of the common paths to unhappiness is sort of this idea or just set of habits or lack of skills
Mm.
that really isolate you from other people.
Mhm.
And just tying back into like, finding happiness where you are. A lot of times I feel like people want to move because they don't feel like they can connect with
Right.
anyone
Yeah.
in their physical location.
Hmm.
In some cases, that probably is harder than others. Like again, going back to my hometown, like the number of people that I saw eye to eye on a number of issues and actually core values, there was a large disparity there. But even in that place, there were people. If I would have had more tools around, kind of like you said, just sort of exploring the community or like
Hmm.
finding different groups or being more vulnerable or whatever else, I probably could have found more of that connection. And I think it's just really important to highlight because, again, a lot of times the answer is not necessarily moving somewhere else. It depends
Right.
on what it is, but just being able to find some sense of community wherever you are, and especially now with the internet, like
Yeah.
now you can really do it without having to go too far. But I think it's important to highlight, and just again, like figuring out which of the buckets your sets of sort of problems or things that are making you unhappy fall under, so that you can make the right choice. Because for a lot of people, moving is something that, while you can take it back, is not necessarily easy or straightforward.
Right. Absolutely. Agreed. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Are there any final points you want to make before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to go back and reiterate that, external factors do matter, right?
Yeah.
There are situations that are very hard to be happy in and other ones that are a lot easier. But often there's a lot of work that can be done internally to increase your happiness, or at least, stop making yourself extra miserable.
Right.
And it's worth playing in the margins there and doing the work there, especially when you're in situations that can be harder to change or take a while, because otherwise the alternative is just to be miserable.
Absolutely. Yes. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and do all the things that help spread the happiness in the world. We will see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.